Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the 29th meeting of the Equalities and Human Rights Committee. Can I ask that everyone switches off mobile devices and puts them away? This morning we have apologies from Annie Wells. Now, agenda item 1 is a decision on taking business in private, and that's our consideration of evidence relating to race equality, taking that in private at this and future meetings. Does the committee agree?
Agreed.
Agreed, thank you. Agenda item 2 is an oral evidence session on race equality in Scotland. Can I welcome our panel this morning? Dr. Gina Nettle, Associate Professor, School of Energy, Geoscience, Infrastructure and Society at Heriot-Watt University. Professor Nazar Mir, Professor of Race, Identity and Citizenship. Professor Raj Bhopal, Emeritus Professor of Public Health, and Professor Rowena Arshad, Chair in Multicultural and Anti-Racist Education and Co-Director of the Centre for Education for Racial Equality in Scotland, all from the University of Edinburgh. Good morning, you're all very welcome. We have about an hour for our session this morning, so if we could keep answers quite pointed and no need to go over things that you've previously said, and we will try and be disciplined in our questioning as well. We'll start off with Oliver Mundell, please.
Thank you, Convener. I just wanted to start by asking you to reflect on the past 20 years of the Scottish Parliament and whether or not you feel we've made sufficient progress on race. Some people we've heard from already feel that too little progress has been made, and that race doesn't feature prominently enough within parliamentary discussions. I just wondered if you had any thoughts or reflections on that.
Shall I start? I might start. Well, I think as was communicated last week, I think evidence is quite clear that there hasn't been nearly as much progress as one would wish. There's a lot of evidence across a number of different fields. I think there has been some progress in terms of structures and in terms of processes and in terms possibly of governance, but there's a lot of scope for actually tightening up the governance structures. And I think if one really wants to see some change, then one has to be much more serious about governance and about accountability and about making sure that key public sector organizations play a role in carrying out their public sector duties.
Yeah. I mean, I think we've come a long way since a colleague in 1980 wondered if race relations in Scotland was a matter of ignorance or apathy. I don't think that's necessarily true today. I think there's been a process of policy literacy underway during that period, but the outcomes haven't radically altered, in my view, and we'll discuss this, I'm sure, in detail. So I see a greater willingness over this period to tackle the issue and take it seriously and to put in place policies and processes to address race inequalities in Scotland, but I think there's still a long way to go.
So the kind of work that I'm doing is actually putting things into practice. And what I am comforted about in the last 20 years since the Parliament started is, as Nasser said, I think the political and policy commitment is there. So we have at least that backdrop now, which we didn't have 20 years ago. So I think that's to be welcomed. On the ground, I think a lot of effort is also being put in by the third sector and others, with support from the Parliament and the Scottish Government, to bolster the capacity of the third sector. I'm not saying that they have not had finance, sort of grants, losing grants, etc. But I think that capacity has also built. Where I'm finding the gaps, actually, when I'm trying to put things in practice, is the middling tier. And I think, therefore, accountability has to be one of the things we look at, because we've got the top and the bottom, but we're having a gap in the middle in terms of action.
I'm going to restrict my comments and discussion mainly around the health and healthcare side. And I brought with me actually quite a lot of evidence. And one of the bits of evidence is a letter I wrote to Susan Deakin, the health minister at the time, in December 1999, where I said that there seemed to be a lack of strategic vision and direction and leadership on only small-scale projects in Scotland. I'm pleased to say that when it comes to health and healthcare, Scotland is somewhat envied across much of the continent of Europe But we have been playing a game of snakes and ladders, and we go up the ladder and come down the snake. And I would say we've actually lost ground quite a lot in the last 5 to 10 years. But we did make a lot of progress. And we've got one of the finest health-related policies in the world, but everyone's forgotten about it. That's why you have to be an old-timer academic who's been around, is there to help make it happen. Fair for all. It's the Health Department letter 2002. It's an amazing bit of work. We couldn't do better now, but people have forgotten about it. It's still on the books, of course, like all Scottish policies. Not only have people forgotten, but they don't want to be reminded about it either. There is a case of let's reinvent the wheel. Let's not bother thinking about what we did in the past. And that brought with me lots of documents, amazing documents that have been produced in Scotland reflecting great work, largely forgotten for reasons that I might discuss later on, and being reinvented, whether it's on gypsy travellers, whether it's on type 2 diabetes, whatever it is. We've been there before, usually 2 or 3 times before. But instead of reminding ourselves of where we were, we tend to start with a blank sheet of paper. But we're much better off than we were in 1999 when it comes to the health and healthcare sector.
Thank you very much for that. A number of you mentioned governance and accountability. Do you think that there's anything specific the Parliament and its committees could do to ensure that we address that and that race is back on the parliamentary agenda?
Monitoring public sector equality duties is really important. Implementation of them, and also, and I think that's where, particularly in terms of employment, because employment cuts across so many different areas, and it would help to improve outcomes in so many different areas as well. If you were in secure, decent work, it would help to improve your health. It would, there are all kinds of spin-off benefits of being in meaningful, well-paid work. So I think particularly looking particularly at employment, public sector bodies can play a major role in actually making sure that they are actually taking the public sector equality duties as seriously as they should, and there should be due monitoring of their activity, and those results should be made public. And we should start with our largest employer, which is the NHS, and we should really hold them to account, because there has been some good work done, but the momentum needs to be kept up, and they need to be continually reminded. And again, I would say, I've been in this field for a long time, and I have seen very good work, but there are same obstacles to actually which seem to have not been tackled, and then there are always exceptions to the rule where actually people do actually manage to break through barriers, and there was an inquiry on barriers to employment 3 years ago from the Parliament, but the momentum from that work, and I see that actions have been taken forward in the Race Equality Plan. There are some actions stemming from that inquiry, and that's good to see. But I think you do need to be smarter about that, and that you can be smarter about that, and more forceful about that as well.
I attended very recently, it's the Scottish Government, I don't think it was a Parliament, it was the National Advisory, I'm written it down, Council on Women and Girls Accountability Day, which is very unusual. I think it was the first time that format had happened, and it was an accountability day where the members of the I suppose the panel, the working group that looked after it were there, but they also invited a range of external people to come along. And then the heads or the leads of the directorates in the Scottish Government, whether that's health or employment or education, had to come, and it was done in a forum in a way that was collegiate. It was about learning. It wasn't about a sort of third degree of the individual. So it was very much, I hope, a learning environment for everybody. But people were held to account and to say what progress had been made against certain items that the panel had recommended. I actually think that's a good format. So if you bring in externals as well. And so, for example, in education, which is my sector, bring in the Funding Council heads, bring in University Scotland, bring in these people who are actually the leaders who should be championing the policies and taking it forward, and ask them to tell you what progress has been made. And as long as it's within a forum of openness and learning rather than pinpointing and blame, then actually it can be a very good accountability plus process. So I just thought that share that one.
I mean, I would only add to that, I suppose. I mean, the two themes which connect what's been said so far is really driving things from the centre and then having an institutional memory around what has been done in the past, what's been achieved, what's succeeded and what's failed. The Race Equality Action Plan, of course, has a number of recommendations across a number of sectors, but it also has something that you could take up here, which is to focus on the general and cross-cutting themes, which are ideally meant to be things which are pulled across the activity of government and not left to, say, the Equality Unit to try to action. And it'd be good to see what progress is made on something like that, which then embeds it as being a core activity rather than a peripheral activity.
If I can also echo points that have been made earlier, and that is, I think Scotland is absolutely superb at creating policies and policy frameworks and getting people around the table for that. But it's not so good at implementing things. And there's a gap between those who create policy, the managers who are supposed to oversee the implementation, and the practitioners who actually implement. I'll take an example, just one example, because I think it's relevant and it's very much in the race equality framework, and that is data. We've been talking about data in Scotland, and again, I'll restrict to ethnicity and health rather than and race and health rather than the whole broad area, because that's what I know about. We've been talking about it for decades. In 2002 to 2005, the Scottish Government funded myself and my colleagues to do an overview of what data were available by ethnic group in Scotland and to propose mechanisms for improving the data. And after 3 years of work, we came to the view that the only good way to get data was to do a linkage between the census and NHS records. That became the Scottish Health and Ethnicity Linkage Study. So the country has invested a lot of money into that study, and we've published about 25 papers on a wide range of health issues. And indeed, those papers are envied across the world. The study is very famous. Scotland's very lucky to have such a study. Most countries don't have anything like that. But when it comes to the routine data, we've got a new paper coming out in the Journal of Public Health, which shows that in recent years, Scotland has increased ethnic coding in Scottish hospitals from about 5% to about 80%. But our analysis, which is the first ever analysis of those data done with ISD, Information Services Division, shows that the data are not good enough for analysis and to make any policy or to take any practical decisions. The quantity is there, but the quality is not there. And I'd like to put it to you that that's often the case, that we actually decide to do something, we do it, but we don't see whether the end result is useful or not. So there's still a lot of work to be done there. And when it comes to the Scottish Health and Ethnicity Linkage Study, well, I've retired, I was the leader, and it's not currently being taken forward. So we're going to lose ground there. So I think there is an issue between policy, management, monitoring, application, and there are gaps there at every level. And I understand why there are gaps. Often it's a lack of resources. We can't afford to employ the people. We can't afford to employ the managers. We can't afford to pay for the extra clinicians required or the extra research. But that's something, when a policy is created, we should think through what resources will be required to implement that policy, not over a 2-year period or a 3-year period, but over a 5, 10, 20-year long-term period of time. Otherwise, what happens is we set up great projects. They're great while they last. When the funding is withdrawn, everything collapses. A few years later, we're back to square one.
Okay, that's very useful. Thank you very much, Convener.
Okay, Mary-Fee.
Thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. There are a number of different definitions and different language used to describe race and ethnicity. Does the panel think those definitions and that language is helpful, or should there be one single definition?
Now, a small question for the panel to consider. My view on this is that it's important to have robust legal criteria which underpins race equality action. There's a multi-level character to that. We can see that at the UN level, we can see that at the UK level, we can see that at the EU level, and then Scotland has a particular manifestation of that. And they broadly coalesce around a number of criteria to do with, culture, national origins, skin colour. But really that's a minimum. And what that criteria means in different contexts actually varies radically. So for a long time, some groups we would consider to be ethnic and racial groups today weren't caught by that criteria and have been folded into it through a process of mobilisation, through a process of protest. The UK example would include Sikh groups, who for a long time weren't considered to be an ethnic group, were deemed to be a religious group and therefore not covered by the race relations legislation. So I wouldn't get wholly fixed on the legal definition of race or ethnicity. I would need to insist on forms of categories which are dynamic and can change over time and which can take into consideration wider power relations which aren't necessarily covered by textbook legal definitions.
I can only add that it's really important to have that nuanced understanding of what ethnicity means and how it interconnects with structural inequalities, how it connects with histories of oppression, slavery, colonialism. All of that is high, the historical context is hugely important, and it needs to, so the legal definition is, as Nasa said, actually a minimum standing point. It's just where you start from.
Okay.
Absolutely agree with that. I think we waste a lot of time debating the legal definition versus whatever, or the terminology versus whatever. And actually, the main focus has to be on improvement for people's lives. And therefore, that means removing structural barriers, personal, cultural barriers, and helping each other understand what that means in practice, developing our literacy about that, rather than actually getting bogged down with worrying about specific terminology. I mean, terminology, as you know, 1960s has changed to what it is now, and identities actually are very fluid as well. And so we can't get sucked into a way of looking at things and then everything else being wrong. For me, it's about the racism, it's about racial literacy, it's about how we help our managers and our practitioners and the people who deliver our services recognise how everyday racism happens. How it happens to different groups of people will be different, but helping them to recognise that and to be able to counter it and to change institutional practices that might be debarring people from actually having equality of opportunity. That should be where our concentration is. I know also that there are people who say, talking about racism and things is very negative, and it's not, it's not palatable, is it? No, of course it's not. But actually, if you just want to talk about diversity and multiculturalism as some kind of politics of happiness, that's fine on one side. But call me a cynic. As I get older, I'm getting more cynical. But actually, the life chance things are the ones that we should be concentrating on. And therefore, let's not get bogged down between legal this or legal that, terminology this or that.
Do you think almost focusing too much on the legal definition can be a detriment to making that progress?
Yes, I think it possibly can, because people can make a lot of assumptions about individuals and how it happens. And actually, most organisations would probably be able to say we meet the minimums of the public sector duty. We actually meet our legal requirements. That's fine. But actually, at the end of the day, it's what else do you need to be doing? Because that should be the safety net. That's what law is there for. It's a safety net for us. And that's the minimum, as Gina was saying.
I think there is a more fundamental barrier, if I might add, and that is really in terms of in terms of Scotland's position within the UK. And the population is a whole lot smaller. It's easier to ignore. I can say that quite clearly. It's easier to ignore, and there's and So you really need quite a lot of political will to actually want to change things, because it's easily sidelined, it's easily overlooked. And there are not often enough people in the room for whom it matters. I have been in too many meetings where I'm the only person bringing up issues related to race equality, and it's an uncomfortable position to be in, to be the only person to actually have to raise these issues.
And you will know from your own experience that law, statutory regulations can often be very slow. Often they can be catching up and actually reflecting a wider movement. And there's something about race equality which, if you reduce it simply to the statute, misses its wider public function in terms of public discourse, in terms of debates about national identity, in terms of how common membership is thought of, and how that then makes sense in workplace settings, in classroom settings, on the street. So legal definitions are fine, but race equality has to be about much more than that.
Professor Bhopal, do you have any view on that?
Well, it's such a fraught area, I'm honest. I'm slightly worried to get into it. I have actually written a lot about definitions and glossaries and what words we should be using in the health sector. Books and many papers being widely accepted in the world of health and healthcare. But it's a very difficult area. Firstly, the concept of race is highly contested. I'm sure the committee is aware. After the Second World War, UNESCO had a major statement to say that there is no such thing as race. There is only one human species, and it can't be subdivided into different races. And many people are putting the word race into inverted commas to say we're not really talking about biology, we're not talking about subspecies of humans, which is the way race was used for so long. We're talking about social relationships. And if we all agree that we're talking about social relationships, then it's fine to use the word race. But many people are not talking about social relationships. They're actually talking about colour, and all the classical views about race, as if there were really subgroups of human beings with different characteristics. So we have to be, it's a dangerous thing. But the reason I believe we can't get away from race is because of racism, because racism is largely founded upon physical characteristics. Therefore, we can't get away from it. I'm a great believer in the concept of ethnicity because it's a more malleable concept. It puts a very heavy emphasis on culture, traditions, ways of behaviour, but it doesn't completely ignore physical characteristics either. But like many of us, I'm conscious that when we start getting into discussions of definitions and terminology, sometimes entire meetings and a whole series of meetings can be taken up, and we end up where we started. I've even been in committees where we spent weeks agreeing a set of words and what they mean, and then for the next 2 years the committee completely ignored all that work. They just went back to their original viewpoints. So a lot of time can be wasted. On the other hand, we do have to be conscious of what the generally agreed definitions of these kind of words are and what they mean in law. And we're very lucky here in the UK because the House of Lords has provided us with a very broad concept of race and racism. And virtually anything can be included within it. And we're very actually lucky, and I speak to my friends and colleagues in the continent, and they don't have such a broad understanding. Indeed, in much of the continent of Europe, they won't even use the word race. They're so unhappy with it. It makes them very uncomfortable. Of course, they had the legacy of the Second World War at hand in a way that we didn't have. We were slightly distanced from it. So I think these are fraught areas, and I would suggest that if the Scottish Parliament wants to do this, they could have a vocabulary that is used across Scottish Government and its partners. And the vocabulary would not be very difficult to achieve because the International Organization for Migration is just one of many international organizations that have set up a vocabulary. We held the first World Congress on Migration, Ethnicity, Race and Health in Edinburgh. We had 750 delegates from more than 50 countries. That was in 2018. And we produced a glossary, and we utilized resources from across the world to produce a glossary which we thought was required to permit a dialogue amongst people from more than 50 countries. I think I would make a recommendation that the Scottish Parliament should actually have a glossary. And you can utilise other people's glossaries to build your own one, and you require your partners to use it.
Very helpful. Of course, the Scottish Parliament is a human rights guarantor, and we're changing the way we look at things and the way we think about things, and this committee are encouraging other committees to look at things through a human rights lens. So if the Scottish Parliament uses the human rights angle, focuses on the legal definition, would that then give us the opportunity to almost refocus the conversation that we have about race and ethnicity and focus on disadvantage and equality? Can we do it that way?
The danger in framing it in those terms is the loss of the specific focus on racial inequality. And to some extent, that will rehearse conversations and debates that I suspect we've all been part of when it came to the harmonisation of equality legislation and the harmonisation of the equality guarantors as watchdogs. I think that a kind of a human rights approach can establish a baseline, but you need to retain a specific commitment to pursuing equalities for particular grounds. And if colleagues were here from the disabilities movement or colleagues were here from other equality grounds, they would probably say the same thing. You can bring these things together in a patchwork, but you need to retain a specific focus because these inequalities land and make sense and manifest in outcomes for different equality strands in different ways.
And also it's important to add to that also the intersectionality of course, of gender disability and race and ethnicity. So I was pleased to see one mention of ethnicity in the race equality framework. That's a start. But, you know, it would be good to see a little bit more nuance carried throughout that action plan in terms of intersectionality, the recognition of intersectionality and how it cuts across different areas and how it might be measured. That's very challenging. It's not easy work, but also, you know, this is, if one was serious, this was kind of thing that one could look at and where one could make advances. In terms of looking also in terms of how one could actually progress also, when I looked across the framework, I didn't across the action plan, I couldn't read from cover to cover, I'm afraid, but I looked, you know, I looked for the use of statistics, and there was only, I think I was quite surprised that there were only 4 uses of statistics and only 1 where actually statistics were actually used. And, you know, we do have data. We do have statistical data. You know, I was also involved in research which looked a few years ago, which looked across the board in terms of what data was available and what data could be used. That was research published by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. But, you know, and so a race equality document like this should draw more on statistical data which can be an indicator of progress. Of course, you can't measure everything that's worth measuring. You know, not what I meant is not everything, not every form of progress can be captured statistically. But, you know, the key use of statistics would be very useful. It would serve as indicators of progress, and that's what I meant about being smarter about looking at whether progress has been made and looking at how and setting targets for public sector bodies. You know, that's kind of more bolder, proactive steps. And again, I'd start with the biggest employers. Set targets, monitor those targets, come back to them and ask, what's your progress been like? And have these honest, open discussions, you know, which are non-confrontational, but serious in intent. Serious in communicating, we mean business.
Do you think almost there's an element that we keep trying to reinvent the wheel? We have the information, we have the data, we just need to use it appropriately and correctly and build on it rather than continuing to do something else?
Indeed, I think a lot of that. You know, I mean, of course, there's never as much as data as one would like. As researchers, we would all say that. But there's, on the other hand, there is also a lot of data that can be used and acted upon. And there are also examples of good practice, which can be shared and in forums where one board, maybe one health board, has done it. And I'm sure that there probably is. Well, I'd like to, a few years ago when we did research among public sector organizations, I saw that one health board was monitoring its statistics, employment statistics according to ethnicity, and they shared it with us, and and we could see the usual patterns of lack of diversity as you rose higher up the scale. Other health boards should also be willing to share that data and to have discussions around this and as to why it's difficult to make progress in this area, what can we do. I think there would be people who would be willing to help. You've got good relationships with public sector organizations, some very, very committed people working, in civil society, very, very committed people who really want to see change and who would work with you. Wholeheartedly with you, if you called on them often enough to actually help you to actually hold public sector bodies to account.
Okay, thank you.
If I can make a comment on your first question, which was about human rights approach, as compared with a more focused approach. I think the problem we have is lack of expertise. You have to build up expertise. These are complex matters, difficult matters, whether it's disability or age discrimination or gender discrimination or racial discrimination or ethnicity. These are very complex matters. It takes years, if not decades, to develop expertise and experience and knowledge about these things. Doesn't come intuitively. I'm going to take the example of the Health Department letter 2002. One of its recommendations was that there should be a National Resource Centre for Ethnic Minority Health. Well, it was set up in 2002 with a director, some staff, and in 2008, 6 years later, it was closed down. And there was a reason for it, because the Equalities Act was coming in and focusing on one aspect, race and ethnicity, and there was a good investment from Scottish Government, has to be said. And was suddenly, how are you going to make the same investment for 9 areas under the Equalities Act? Well, anyway, in its wisdom, the Scottish Civil Servant and others decided that the Resource Centre would now be merged into NHS Health Scotland. And it would be having a broader remit across the Equalities remit. Well, actually, everything just evaporated. Nothing has been left. The documents on gypsy travellers, the diabetes, they've been forgotten. Everything's gone. The evaluation framework that was developed, everything's gone. So sometimes you want to do something, i.e. you want to have a broader viewpoint, but it's actually very hard, because unless you have the staff with the expertise, the knowledge, and the history of everything, then really you have to start from scratch again. So I think you've got to find that balance between an integrated approach, working across sectors, a human rights approach, and a more specific issue-specific approach, like whether it's gender, whether it's ethnicity and race, or whatever it happens to be. I think we've lost it. We've lost it a little bit. So the Equalities Act is an amazing act, but how do you handle all that work? And how do you handle it without a more specific focus? And I felt that the report today we've had on progress in relation to the new race equality framework, I thought the bits on health were very thin gruel compared with where we've been in the past. Yes.
Pause you there, because Fulton McGregor's going to ask specifically about that, so I'll bring him in, and if anyone has extras, I'm conscious we're halfway through, and it's very interesting and important what you're saying. Fulton.
Sorry, can I add?
I'll come back to you. I'm just keen to move us on to the next slide.
Okay, thanks, Convener. Good morning, panel. As Convener said, I've got a few questions around the Race Equality Action Plan and Equality Framework, which I think most of you have referred to. I'm just wondering, as a general starting point, what involvement you've had in these, if any, and what that's been. I'm happy to take any order.
I've been closely involved in the Race Equality framework, but I've been involved in the Fair Work Convention and Fair Work Group and a working group, strategic group. And I've said, similar comments there that I'm saying now in terms of employment, which is why I'm trying to make the connection. I think there's a lot of scope for trying to work across committees. I was pleased to see the meetings of the program board publicly available, and I read all 4 meetings. It was good to see these issues being looked at a high level, at a strategic level. It would also be good to see because there's a strategic group and there's also an operational group. So it would be helpful actually to see what the operational work was doing that's informing the strategic working group. As far as knowledge of the plan goes, it's really from coming. I needed to be reminded of the key documents, the key components, but it was easy to tap into them because I had been involved previously in such work.
So I chair one of the subgroups looking at diversifying the teaching profession. I did a report which had 17 recommendations, and Deputy First Minister has asked me to continue chairing that to make the recommendations happen. It's a bit of a gift, really. So doing that. And one of the things I want to say is the issue about data, which is why I wanted to come back and say I'm going to take a slightly different view. I think we have to look at it sector by sector. In education, in schools, I don't think we have enough data. In universities, I don't think we have enough data. So, for example, one of our recommendations was to find out from universities who's applying, do they get in, what's their progression when they get in, and what kind of exit award do they get. So it's about attainment. I can get the data about who applies because UCAS have that data largely, so somebody else is holding it, and the Funding Council have that data. I am having real difficulty trying to get data from universities about who then gets interviewed, who then gets through. I can get the exit awards data at some point, but it all relies on me chasing every single point for that data. So some data is missing and some data is just hard to get. So I think we have to look at it sector by sector. I don't think we can say university there is enough data.
In terms of participation in the race equality framework, I suspect all of us were part of the consultations and in the evidence working groups. I had a project funded by the Royal Society of Edinburgh which was looking specifically as to whether Scotland has developed a specific approach to race equality. And we held an event at the beginning of the process of consultation to the creation of the race equality framework. We published a report on Scotland and race equality policy with the Runnymede Trust and the University of Edinburgh, and we're just now developing a 4-year follow-up to that, which rather than looking at mapping inequalities, we're actually looking at successes and failures in pulling through the policy process, and hopefully that will be ready in the beginning of 2020, and that's in collaboration with colleagues involved in the race equality framework, and I'll be happy to share that with the panel.
I was consulted as in the earlier stages of the development of the race equality framework, and in particular Kalyani Lyle and her team came and saw me and my colleagues on several occasions. We supplied a lot of the health-related information and research that went into her report. And then I was able to see how her report was translated by the civil service into a set of actions, and I've been able to examine the latest information provided on what actions have been taken and how things are going. So on the health side, I think it's probably not immodest to say that it was based upon information supplied by me and my colleagues from the University of Edinburgh.
Okay, thanks very much for that. You'll be aware that last week we had another panel in Crair highlighted several concerns regarding the Racial Equality Action Plan, and that 40% of the updates in progress do not have a race focus. Instead, they're included in a wider strategy. I know that some of you began to speak about this already in data collection and other aspects, but I'm wondering if you can let us know what you think about this approach generally and what impact it may have And again, I'm happy to sort of go in any order.
We started to touch upon this, so perhaps I will continue. There has been attention for decades in this field of migration, ethnicity, race and health as to whether there should be issue-specific services and policies, or whether there should be what is termed mainstreaming, that where you actually bring those issues in and into the mainstream of policy and service delivery. And generally in our field, there is a view that it has to be mainstreamed, that you can't just start developing new policies and new services which are just specific for one racial group or a range of racial groups, and then you would have to have a series of policies by gender, you have to have a series of policies by disability. It's not practical or feasible. So there has to be mainstreaming, but the information used to help that mainstreaming work effectively has to be, if I can use that phrase, race-specific or the ethnic group-specific. So you have to have the knowledge to go into the mainstream policy, the mainstream service. You have to be able to adapt the service. So I could see that when I read the report here, the latest information. I could see that there has been an attempt at mainstreaming. But I did use the phrase, it's pretty thin gruel. It was 2016. There's been 3 years to do things. And what I got the impression, and may I say I've sat on innumerable health committees in my 35-year career, and I know how they work because I've been both on the side of the service providers and the policy makers, and I get the impression that what's happened here is, we have to report. So what can we find that we can somehow or other stick in to this report to look respectable, as opposed to in 2016 we started a lot of very important work with our partners, and now we're reporting the progress on that work. And I think there is a difference. And the difference is that I don't think the NHS and has got the resources at the moment to actually take things that seriously, where there's so much to do, people just get on with it and they say, well, we've got to do this as well. Now we have to report. How can we report? And I would like to, if I was on your side, I would like to delve into what structures have been put in place, which personnel have been employed, who are they working with, who are their partners, and are we really going to deliver on any of this? Because there's not much evidence of real serious delivery at this point. The intention is still there, but the intention was there in 2016 too. And I would say that if I go back to some of my earlier reports I brought with me, there's far more evidence of real action having been taken in the period 2003 to 2014, say, than currently. So I don't think we're back to square one. We're not. We're much further ahead than that. But I think even before we started this meeting, there's potential for a lot more.
I'd say, to qualify that slightly, I'd say we're a lot further on in certain respects, but very, as Ransi has gone backwards in other respects. And I think the change in it, the loss of the Race Equality Commission, the loss of race relations, there was a specific focus when the Race Relations Act came in, its amendment came in, there was very focused attention in this area. That's lost. That's, without a doubt you can say that's lost. And to some extent you can see why, because public sector organizations are trying to grapple with a number of different equality strands. So it is a more challenging arena to work within.
I mean, to speak in favour of the race equality framework, I think we all probably take the view that what we liked about it was its ambition and its commitment to being a long commitment rather than, something which lasts the duration of one particular administration, a 16-year strategy. But as we've indicated at the outset, there is this dissonance between ambition, aspiration, high-level commitment, and then follow-through. And in the sectors of the race equality framework, we haven't seen a huge improvement in terms of the reported experience, specifically of black and ethnic minorities in Scotland. So I've been running surveys in Scotland since 2015. I repeated it again in 2017. I repeated it again this year in 2019. And they specifically ask questions about, for example, in the labour market, in work, experiences of racial discrimination. Hasn't changed, hasn't gone down. And the same can be repeated of sectors of education. What has rocketed up during that period between 2015, 2017, 2019 has been public displays and public experiences of racial discrimination, particularly in transport. So during this period in which we've got a serious commitment to a race equality strategy, the outcomes in terms of the experiences for black and ethnic minorities, in particular in Scotland, don't appear to be improving.
I think mainstreaming has to be the place to be to start with, because as Raj says, we can't keep having proliferation of extra services. However, last week you heard Kalyani say, I think, that is highly dependent on the ones who are delivering to have the knowledge to actually be able to mainstream. So we've not looked at the knowledge base and the literacy levels of individuals, whether it's on racism or any other ism for that matter, then actually mainstreaming becomes more patchy. So you tend to go with the issues that you're more comfortable with. And let's face it, issues like racism, there's an avoidance. So in schools education, we talk a lot about inclusion. And because we talk about inclusion, we must be including everybody. Yes, probably are, and technically, but there will be some people who will not feel as included as others. So I think we can hide under words like mainstreaming, inclusion, if we're not forensic about it. I met with a group of students yesterday who was in the university who were talking about their experiences of racism, actually out in the streets, but also on campus, but largely out in the streets. And one of them said to me, do we have a counselling service that I can go to in the university where there are counsellors that can understand this? Now, you could say our counselling service is mainstreamed. We have lots of counsellors who would argue that they can serve the entire student population. But actually, what this student was saying is, I need somebody who can understand what's happened to me. And possibly not to spend the first 10 minutes of that therapy session explaining what that means. So I think that if you are mainstreaming, you have to have flexibility to have specific services as well, so that there are safe spaces for people.
Good morning to the panel. I'd like to continue the discussion about both the Race Equality Framework and the Race Equality Action Plan. This has been touched on a little bit in our discussion so far, but I'd like to tease this out a bit further. This committee understands the importance of engagement with the community, with communities, and whilst the Race Equality Framework was widely consulted on, it's not entirely clear to us that that was the case for the Race Equality Action Plan and its update. And do you have a view on the engagement in the Equality Action Plan and how it's been received by grassroots communities? Who would like to go first?
Ask because we don't necessarily reflect those sectors. We can take an opinion on it, and one opinion might be that in the establishing of the race equality framework, there was a relatively broad consultation and perhaps a presumption that there was sufficient consensus to translate that into a race equality action plan. So to some extent there may have been a bit of a shortcut there, and a presumption that there was continuity between what was said at this stage may be true of that stage. That may also be a reflection of resources, maybe a reflection of time, but I don't think the consultation in terms of the action plan has been comparable to the consultation in terms of the engineering of the race equality framework. I don't know if that's led to particular complaints about not being listened to. I suspect that it has, and I've picked some of that up in research conversations, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, okay. So I think I'd add that I would support that, because I think if there had been widespread consultation, we would have been involved. I think I would almost certainly have been involved in that consultation, and I wasn't. So, yeah, I think it's indicative, and I don't think any of us were involved in, well, maybe, you know, I shouldn't speak for everybody else, but, you know, we were not involved. Certainly I was not involved in the action plan, and I could have been helpful, perhaps, in steering or suggesting certain things. And some of the, even looking at the program board meetings and the minutes, it leaves me questioning certain things. because it's great to have the minutes, but also just to actually wonder why certain decisions were made. It's not entirely clear. For example, it says in the 1 minute, in 1 minute, I think the last one, it says that in terms of employment, so it says that that the childcare was looked as a possible case study. Childcare workforce recruitment data was looked at as a possible case study, but it's not explained why childcare workforce data. And it would, maybe it's an entirely appropriate decision to be made, but we always, in a university setting, you're always asked to justify your choice of case studies. Why did you choose childcare? Why? What were the good reasons for choosing childcare as an area to focus on recruitment data? Those kind of questions need exploring, need teasing out. Is this the best use of limited resources? Is this where we should start? Can we take up, this is what I mean about being smart about things, and can we make a bigger impact if we picked up some other workforce data to look at? That kind of thinking, within limited resources, what can we do that will be impactful?
So within each of your contributions today, we've heard about areas where we've moved forward and then areas where things have slipped back. And in terms of the delivery of the Race Equality Action Plan, do you think then, from what you've just said, Dr. Neto, about the lack of a feedback loop, almost, where you can't sense check things as they're being delivered on the ground, that we need to revisit that?
I think so, yes. I think it's great that, at least, that now, that the Race Equality Action Plan is receiving some scrutiny, but perhaps that scrutiny should come more regularly, so that it can be checked a little bit more, steered.
I think that was what I was meaning about the Accountability Day example that I gave much, much earlier. I think in education, yes, I certainly was consulted about what should be some of the top priority areas that we looked at in education. And without doubt, the absence of a diverse teaching workforce, it's there it doesn't need research, any more research on it. We all know we want a much more diverse workforce. So in the next stage after that, when we started the Short Life Working Group, we did take evidence from teachers and a whole range of stakeholders. So I would say the people who've got a vested interest in that will be teachers in the field. So in that sense, I think the ground was looked at, and those voices continue to inform the discussions. What we haven't, and this is the next stage of my work, is to say to how are we going to engage with Black minority ethnic parents in this, because they need to buy in on this as well, and what are their views? Maybe they don't have as much of a worry as the rest of us do about it. So that's our next stage. So I wonder whether you need to also look at what the next level is doing. It's not just about the plan itself and the consultation at that point.
Thank you. Dr.
Myself, I was not involved beyond Kalyani Lal's report, and we supplied the information. And when I read the Race Equality Framework and the action plan, I could see that it was reflecting a lot of what was in her report. And I think I would ask a very simple question. What mechanisms do we have for consulting with communities and the third sector at the moment in Scotland? And there is one that I've worked with over the years, that's the Regional Equality Councils. Have they been consulted? So it's a simple question for your committee to ask. Have they been consulted? When were they consulted? How often have they been consulted? What is the process for consulting them? Because to my knowledge, that is the main route into communities. And I don't know whether they've been consulted or not. I don't know if you know.
It's a question we can ask. Thank you. Dr. Neto, you mentioned employment would be a good area for us to look at. Obviously, there's a number of policy areas within the plan: education, health, housing, poverty, community cohesion, participation. Given the panel's academic expertise, which particular ones of these would you suggest that we probe further?
So you're asking me, or you're
I'm asking
the
everybody. And you spoke about employment.
Yes, I would say it's key to getting out of poverty, so it's hugely important. You know, we in terms of educational achievements, I accept that there's work to be done, but there's also evidence, of ethnic minorities performing very well academically, but finding it difficult to translate those academic outcomes in the labor market. So that's the block. It's a block out of it. It's a serious block, and it affects social participation, the ability to participate in, to be represented in Parliament, to be all of these things. It connects to people's ability to engage in a full sphere of public life.
Yeah, I mean, I'm looking at my own short life working groups work. Employment would be a good one, because that's what we want to do, is diversify the teaching profession, so that it's an employment. And I think to myself, the issue of representation is key. One of the young people saying, if I can't see myself there, I can't imagine myself there, type statement. And actually, I think we are still quite woeful in, I think we have two head teachers who could be visible minorities in Scotland. That's appalling. Appalling. I think that's two, maybe one more than one, which is a couple of years ago. But I think we need to see those kinds of, so it's not just employment, it's also about promotion, progression.
Does anyone else wish to?
I mean, certainly the core sectors, so labour market participation, employment, education, but also housing. I mean, these are the basis on which people can lead a full and a rich life in Scotland. And then there are, you might think about the connecting sectors in terms of social participation, political participation, the role of civic life. But certainly labour market participation, education and housing, which are the most associated with either being locked into poverty or being able to kind of be socially mobile and move out of those sectors.
Thank you.
I agree.
Okay, thank you. Angela Constance.
Thank you very much, Convener, and good morning to the panel. People have mentioned already the programme board and delivery group, the purpose of which is to actually drive forward the Race Equality Action Plan and to try and ensure that we reduce that gap between aspiration and delivery on the ground. So that's the purpose of it anyway. I would just be interested to know the panel's views on how effective that group has been to date, how it could be more effective in driving forward change, within government and across government, and whether you had specific views about resources associated with the implementation of the Race Equality Action Plan, and whether you supported the recommendation by Claire that given that the Race Equality Advisor would be replaced, whether there was an argument for an external wider stakeholder group. I know that's a few things wrapped up into one.
Well, I mean, I'll just be very brief on this. I mean, I think that again, the ambition of the race equality framework and then taken forward into the action plan was that it wouldn't necessarily sit within one division in the equality unit. I think thus far it probably has too much and been driven by at least 2 or 3 people in there. And I would like to know whether that's a reflection of resistance or resource insofar as it hasn't been pulled right across the activities of the Scottish Government, certainly across all the devolved sectors. So that's one question for you, really, to some extent. But I would certainly support the idea of having an external set of eyes on this. I think there's a way in which that both enriches the activity of government, but also elevates the capacity for accountability. So I would very much endorse that recommendation.
Okay. Other members of the panel?
I would say that in terms of its composition, I was pleased to see representation from the various departments, and that's a good way of trying to connect the work of the Equality Unit with the various units within Scottish Government in terms of the structure of the board. I think also, yes, that the point about external scrutiny or external drawing, I think it's how you do it. I think Kalyani did a great job in terms of brought a wealth of experience to this, to the work of the group. I think it could also be a lonely position for her to be in as independent advisor, you know, without the backup of other members of her, of the community, of the communities that she is attempting to advance the position of. It's a lonely position, you know, however experienced, however committed and specialized one has in terms of experience one has to offer. So I think, yes, the external scrutiny board might be a way with perhaps drawing in people with particular expertise as needed at different points. And I see that, you know, there's some, you do have guests here, but maybe to think again in a more systematic way how this could be done would be good.
Thank you. Professor Bhopal.
Again, to the National Advisory Group on Women and Girls as an example of a model to follow. The other thing I would say also, I mean, in the area that I'm involved in, which is education and schools education, is the Strategic Board of Teacher Education that has the oversight on pushing through the recommendations. And I guess, you know, the test will be whether they will help us do that when we're facing blocks. At this point, I'm working through the system, but if I'm facing blocks, is whether that board will then assist me to open up those barriers and take down those barriers, or whether the blocks are where my job ends, so, which shouldn't be. But the other thing about an external group is also it can ask questions. And I do think it is important to have external eyes. So I'd concur with my colleagues and Creer's point there. One of the groups that we use incessantly in education is a group called the Scottish Minority Ethnic Educators Group, SAMI. This group is used by local authorities, by my own working group, for advice, to speak, to support, but they're totally unfunded. And so there lies a division, because the education system is not the group that funds that sector organisations, is the Equalities unit. And a group like that, which is so heavily used in one sector, how do they then become part of that table when the table is already crowded with organisations you're already funding? That's, I guess, a pretty controversial question to be asking, but it's one that one has to think about.
Just to paraphrase for the record, it's you're talking about the importance of the delivery group, the strategic programme board, being connected to a range of organisations and the right organisations, and that's over and above the importance of external eyes. It's with people who have a locus on delivery in the front line across a range of environments.
I think that's fair. Thank you.
I can make a couple of comments on this. Firstly, it's only in preparation for this meeting that I have heard about the Race Programme Board. I don't know whether other people have heard about it. Again, you might want to see whether the racial equality or regional equality councils have heard of this programme board. And the question I ask myself is, these are very high-powered people with multiple responsibilities on this board. How are they actually implementing or delivering? What structures have they put in place to make delivery possible? I mean, I have referred back to this National Resource Centre for Ethnic Minority Health. It had about 4 or 5 people and a director. So the Scottish Government had a route through to make things happen. NHS Health Scotland could go to that place and make things happen. ISD could go there, or this group could go there. So do we not need some infrastructure like that, perhaps a Scottish Equity Institute or something like that, that can actually, so committees like this, high-powered committees like the programme board, have actually got people to work with and through, because you have to connect to that very wide range of services, and communicating and consulting with people is a time-consuming and arduous and difficult job. And so I wonder if we're actually setting up quite high-powered committees, but without the infrastructure to allow them to be successful.
I think just to say that's what I meant about being smart about governance structures and how they connect with other structures.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, panel, thank you very much for your time and your evidence this morning. It's been very helpful. Details of the next committee meeting will be available on the committee's website, and I now move us into private session.